Some people think cruelty is loud, but the most dangerous kind is the one that looks like silence. The rope tightened with a dry creak under the late afternoon sun as Daniel Hayes pulled it through his calloused hands, the fibers rough against skin that had known too many seasons and too little rest, and in the center of the dusty yard stood the horse, a pale gray Mustang with eyes that didn't belong to this place, eyes that didn't belong to anything that could be owned, and yet there it was, bound and still, its head lowered just enough to make the watching crowd uneasy in a way they couldn't quite explain, because it wasn't fear they saw in that animal. Not exactly, it was something older, something watching back. A murmur rippled through the gathered townsfolk as boots shifted against gravel and a screen door somewhere slammed in the distance, too hard for the quiet moment, too loud for what they were witnessing, and a woman near the fence crossed her arms tight against her chest, whispering that it wasn't right. That no man should handle a creature like that, not after everything that had happened to him, not after the fire, but Daniel said nothing, not to them, not to the wind that carried the dry scent of cedar and dust across the yard, not even to the horse whose breath came slow and steady like it was waiting for something only it understood. The cloth in his hand was dark, worn thin at the edges, and when he stepped closer the horse didn't flinch, didn't pull away, didn't resist. And that was what unsettled them most, the way it allowed him, the way it leaned just slightly into his presence like a shadow remembering its shape. And when Daniel lifted the cloth and tied it gently but firmly over the horse's eyes, a gasp broke somewhere behind him, sharp and quick, followed by the soft cry of a child who didn't understand why something so still could feel so wrong. "He's gone too far," a man muttered under his breath, low enough to sound like concern, loud enough to be heard. But Daniel didn't turn, didn't defend himself, didn't explain, because there was something in the way the horse's ears flicked beneath the cloth, something in the tension of its neck that told a story no one else was listening for, and as the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint rattle of metal from somewhere beyond the barn, the horse's entire body stiffened for just a heartbeat, a single tremor that passed like a memory trying to surface, and Daniel felt it through the rope, through the air, through something deeper than touch. Years ago, on a night that burned itself into the bones of this land, fire had taken more than wood and hay, it had taken voices, names. Pieces of a man that never came back, and though no one spoke of it openly anymore, the silence around Daniel had grown heavier with each passing season, shaping him into something the town no longer understood, a figure seen at a distance, moving between fence posts and fading light like part of the landscape itself. Now, standing in that same fading light, with the Mustang before him and the weight of 100 unspoken judgments pressing in from every side, he pulled the final knot tight and stepped back just enough to watch, not the crowd, not their reactions, but the horse, because this moment was never for them, it never had been, and somewhere beyond the edges of what anyone could see, something was beginning to move, something quiet and patient, like truth waiting for the right kind of silence to be heard. The crowd did not leave, not right away, because moments like this had a way of holding people in place, as if stepping away might mean missing something they would later wish they had understood, and so they lingered along the fence line, boots pressed into the dirt, arms folded, voices lowered but never fully quiet, while the sky above the valley shifted from pale gold to a deeper amber that stretched long shadows across the ranch yard. Daniel Hayes stood a few paces from the horse, the rope loose in his hand now, his posture still, almost distant, like a man listening to something far beyond the reach of ordinary sound, and the Mustang, blindfolded yet unafraid, adjusted its weight slowly, testing the ground beneath its hooves as though learning it again for the first time, each breath measured, each movement deliberate, and then it happened again, that faint sound drifting through the air, a soft metallic clink carried by the breeze from somewhere behind the old barn, subtle enough that most would miss it entirely, but not the horse, never the horse, because its ears twitched sharply beneath the cloth, its neck tightening, muscles coiling not in panic but in recognition, and Daniel saw it, felt it, the same way he had before, the same way he had years ago when the world had split open and left him standing in the smoke of everything he had lost. A man near the gate shook his head and muttered that this had gone on long enough, that someone ought to step in before things got worse, but no one moved, not yet, because there was something in Daniel's stillness that made interruption feel like a mistake, something in the way he watched the horse not as an owner, not as a handler, but as if he were waiting for it to remember something it had buried deep. The wind shifted again, stronger this time, brushing across the dry grass and rattling a loose piece of tin against the side of the barn, and the sound echoed just enough to draw a sharper reaction, the Mustang stepping back once, its head lifting beneath the blindfold, breath quickening for a brief moment before settling again under the weight of something unseen, something it was trying to face without turning away, and Daniel took a slow step forward, not pulling the rope, not forcing movement, just closing the distance with the quiet patience of someone who understood that. Trust was not given, it was returned. The memory came to him then, not as a clear picture but as fragments stitched together by sensation, the crackle of timber, the smell of burning hay, the sound of metal striking metal in the chaos of that night, and beneath it all, the unmistakable rhythm of hooves against wood, desperate and trapped, a sound that had followed him into every quiet moment since, and now, standing here with this horse, with this same tension coiled beneath its skin, he knew what the others did not, that this was not cruelty unfolding before them, not madness, not neglect, but something far more difficult to witness, the slow and deliberate act of bringing a buried fear into the open where it could finally be seen. The horse shifted again, one step forward this time, hesitant but willing, its hooves pressing into the dust as if marking a path that only it could sense, and Daniel's grip on the rope remained light, almost symbolic, because whatever came next would not be led by force, it would be led by something deeper, something neither man nor animal could fully name. And as the last light of the sun slipped behind the hills, leaving the ranch bathed in a dim, copper glow, the silence that settled over the watching crowd was no longer filled with judgment, but with the quiet, uneasy realization that they were no longer witnessing an act to be condemned, but the beginning of something they did not yet understand. The first step was small, so small that some in the crowd were not even sure it had happened, a shift of weight, a faint press of hoof into dust, but Daniel saw it clearly, the way the Mustang leaned forward as if answering something beyond the edge of sound, and he did not pull the rope, did not guide or correct, he only followed, matching the pace of that cautious movement as the animal took another step, then another, each one measured, uncertain, yet driven by something deeper than instinct. The blindfold remained in place, a barrier not meant to punish but to quiet the world, to strip away the distractions that had once turned every sound into a threat, and without sight the horse listened, truly listened, its ears flicking beneath the cloth as the evening settled into a cooler hush, broken only by the distant creak of wood and that same faint metallic note that drifted like a memory carried on the wind. Daniel's boots moved slowly across the yard, leaving shallow impressions in the dry earth, his shoulders relaxed but his attention sharp, because he knew this was the moment where most would make the mistake of control, where fear would lead them to tighten the rope, to force direction, to demand obedience, but he did none of that, because this was not about control, it was about trust finding its way back through the cracks of something once broken. The horse paused again near the edge of the yard, its head lifting slightly as the sound grew clearer, not louder, just closer, and beyond the fence line the old barn stood in silhouette against the fading sky, its boards weathered, its roofline uneven, a place most in town had long since stopped paying attention to, but Daniel had not since the night it had carried more than silence within its walls. A low murmur stirred behind them as someone shifted position, and a man finally spoke louder than before, saying this had gone far enough, that the animal needed proper handling, that whatever Daniel was doing was only making things worse, but still no one stepped forward, because even in their doubt there was hesitation, a sense that interrupting now might break something fragile that had only just begun to form. The Mustang exhaled slowly, a soft breath that rose in the cooling air, and then it moved again, this time with more certainty, angling its body toward the barn as if drawn by an invisible thread, and Daniel followed without resistance. The rope hanging loose between them, a connection that required no tension, only presence. As they crossed the boundary of the yard, the ground changed beneath their feet, shifting from packed dirt to the rougher texture of scattered gravel and old boards, and the sound returned, clearer now, a hollow metallic tap carried from within the barn, irregular yet persistent, like something brushing against memory rather than matter, and the horse reacted not with panic but with a deep, rooted tension that held steady instead of breaking, its muscles tight but contained, as if it were standing at the edge of something it had once run from but could no longer ignore. Daniel stopped just short of the barn door, his gaze fixed not on the structure itself but on the horse, watching the subtle changes in its posture, the way its breathing shifted, the way its ears angled forward despite the darkness behind the cloth. And for a long moment neither of them moved, the air between man and animal filled with a quiet understanding that did not need words, and somewhere beyond the reach of the watching crowd, beyond the fading light and the restless wind, the past waited, not as something gone, but as something unfinished, something that had found its way back to the surface, asking, patiently, to be faced. The barn door stood half open, its hinges worn by years of wind and weather, and as the last light of day slipped behind the hills, a thin line of shadow stretched across the ground like a threshold waiting to be crossed, and the Mustang felt it before it moved, its body tightening not in fear but in anticipation, as though every step forward carried the weight of something it had once known too well. Daniel did not speak, not because he had nothing to say, but because words had never been part of this, never been enough to reach what was buried beneath instinct and memory, so he stood beside the horse, close enough to feel the warmth of its breath, far enough to give it space, and when the faint metallic sound came again from within the barn, softer now but unmistakable, the horse lowered its head slightly beneath the blindfold, ears angling forward, listening not just to the sound but to the silence that followed it. The crowd remained at a distance, their voices reduced to whispers that no longer carried the same certainty as before, because something had shifted, something they could not name but could not ignore either, and even the man who had spoken earlier now stood with his arms at his sides, watching without interruption, as if he too had begun to sense that this moment did not belong to judgment. The Mustang took a slow step toward the barn, its hoof pressing against the old wooden plank at the entrance, and the sound it made was enough to stir something deeper, a faint echo that seemed to linger longer than it should, and Daniel saw the change immediately, the subtle tremor in the horse's flank, the tightening of its muscles as it stood at the edge of memory, not retreating, not resisting, but holding steady in a place where it once would have turned away. He reached out then, not to guide, not to restrain, but to rest his hand lightly against the side of its neck, a quiet reassurance, a reminder that it was not alone in this space, and the horse responded not with movement, but with stillness, a grounded presence that spoke louder than any reaction. Inside the barn, the air carried the scent of aged wood and dust, untouched corners holding the quiet history of seasons long past, and somewhere within, that faint metallic note returned again, a gentle tapping as if something unseen had shifted just enough to be noticed, and the horse leaned forward, one step deeper into the shadow, its breathing steady but heavy with recognition. Daniel followed, his boots crossing the threshold with a soft scrape, and for a moment the world outside seemed to fall away, the murmurs of the crowd fading into the distance as the dim interior wrapped around them, leaving only the rhythm of breath, the creak of wood, and the quiet persistence of that sound. The horse stopped once more, head lifted beneath the cloth, and Daniel could feel the tension rising again, not sharp, not breaking, but present, like a question waiting to be answered, and he did not rush it, did not push it forward, because he knew this was where most would fail, where impatience would undo everything. But he had learned, in ways the others had not, that healing did not come from force, it came from facing what had once been impossible to face. The metallic sound came again, closer now, and the horse shifted its weight forward, not away, and in that quiet, fragile moment, it chose to remain, to listen, to stand in the presence of something it had once feared, and Daniel stood beside it, silent and steady, as the past began to take shape in the darkness ahead. The darkness inside the barn was not complete, but it carried a weight that made every movement feel slower, more deliberate, as if time itself had thickened within those weathered walls, and the Mustang stood just beyond the threshold, its body aligned with something unseen, something it had not yet touched but already recognized, and Daniel remained at its side, his hand still resting lightly against its neck, not guiding, not restraining, only present, as the faint metallic sound echoed once more, this time clearer, no longer carried by the wind but grounded in the stillness of the space ahead. The horse shifted forward, one careful step at a time, its hooves brushing against the old wooden floor, each contact producing a hollow tone that seemed to answer the distant tapping, as if the barn itself remembered something and was quietly repeating it, and Daniel felt it too, not as fear, not as doubt, but as a deep, steady pull, like a memory that had waited years for this exact moment to return. In the far corner of the barn, where the light from the doorway barely reached, something moved, not with intention, not with life, but with the subtle sway of a loose chain hanging from a beam above, its end brushing softly against a rusted bucket with each shift of air, creating that same rhythmic metallic note. simple and ordinary to anyone else, but not to the horse, never to the horse. The Mustang stopped several feet away, its head lifting slightly beneath the blindfold, its breathing deepening, and for a moment it did not move at all, as if standing at the edge of something it could not see but could fully feel. And Daniel did not step ahead, did not close the distance, because he understood that this was not his moment to lead, this was the horse's moment to remember without being overwhelmed. The air grew still, even the faint sounds from outside seemed to fade, leaving only the soft rhythm of breath and the quiet tapping of metal against metal, and the horse took another step forward, slower this time, its muscles tense but controlled, its presence grounded in a way that spoke of effort, not fear, and Daniel could feel the change, the difference between a reaction driven by panic and one shaped by choice, and this was choice, fragile but real. He eased his hand away from the horse's neck, allowing it complete freedom within the space, and though the rope still hung loosely from his fingers, it held no influence now, no command, only a connection that no longer needed tension. The Mustang lowered its head slightly, as if searching for the source of the sound beneath the cloth, its ears flicking forward, then stilling, and in that moment, something shifted, not in the barn, not in the air, but within the horse itself, a subtle release, a softening that replaced the tightness Daniel had felt since the beginning, and though the past had not disappeared, though whatever memory lingered in that space remained, it no longer held the same power over the present. The chain swayed once more, the bucket responded with its hollow note, and the horse did not step back, did not resist, it simply stood there, steady and aware, as if it had finally reached the place it had been searching for, not to escape it, but to face it, and Daniel watched in silence. His expression unchanged but his understanding deepened, because this was never about forcing a horse to obey, it was about giving it the space to stand where it once could not, and in doing so, reclaim something that had been taken without ever being lost. For a long moment nothing changed, and yet everything had already begun to shift, because the horse no longer stood as something braced against the past but as something present within it, its breathing steady, its stance grounded, and Daniel could feel the difference not through force or control but through the absence of resistance, a quiet space where tension had once lived now giving way to something steadier, something earned. The chain moved again, brushing the side of the bucket with a soft, hollow note that echoed through the barn, and this time the Mustang did not tighten, did not retreat, it simply listened, its ears adjusting beneath the cloth, its body holding firm as if testing the sound for what it truly was rather than what it once meant, and Daniel watched closely, not with urgency but with patience, because this was the moment that could not be rushed, the moment where trust either deepened or broke, and he knew better than to interfere. Outside, the last light of the day faded completely, leaving only a dim gray glow at the edges of the doorway, and the crowd that had gathered earlier now stood quieter than before, their presence distant, almost forgotten, as if the boundary of the barn had drawn a line between judgment and understanding, and even those who had doubted him most no longer spoke, because something about the stillness inside demanded silence. The Mustang took a slow breath, deeper than before, its chest rising and falling with a rhythm that matched the calm Daniel carried within himself, and then, almost imperceptibly, it shifted forward another step, closing the final distance to the source of the sound, its hoof resting near the base of the hanging chain, close enough that the faint movement of air stirred it again, producing that same metallic tone. But now the horse did not react as it had before, there was no flinch, no hesitation, only awareness. As if it had reached the point where memory no longer controlled response, Daniel loosened his grip on the rope even further until it nearly slipped from his fingers, not because he was letting go, but because there was nothing left to hold, and slowly, without sudden movement, he reached up and untied the cloth from the horse's eyes, the fabric falling away with a soft motion that revealed the animal's gaze, calm and steady, not searching for escape but resting on the space before it, taking in the shape of the barn, the beam above, the chain, the bucket, all of it, without fear. The horse blinked once. Then again, adjusting not just to the light but to the understanding that what it faced now was not what it had faced before, and Daniel stepped back, giving it room to see, to choose, to decide what this place meant now, and the Mustang did not turn away, it did not pull back toward the door, instead it remained, its head lowering slightly as if acknowledging something quiet and final within itself. The chain swayed once more. The bucket answered with its hollow sound, and this time it was Only a sound, nothing more, and Daniel exhaled slowly, a breath he had carried for longer than he realized, because this had never been about the horse alone, it had been about something shared, something mirrored between them, and as he stood there in the dim barn with the night settling around them, he understood that what had just happened could not be explained in simple terms, not to the crowd, not to anyone waiting outside, because some things were not meant to be understood from a distance, only witnessed in the quiet where fear finally loses its hold. The stillness inside the barn did not break, but it changed, like the air after a long storm when the ground has not yet dried but the sky has already cleared, and the Mustang stood there with its eyes open, no longer searching, no longer bracing, simply present in a way that felt unfamiliar even to itself, and Daniel watched without stepping closer, without reaching out, because there was nothing left to guide, nothing left to correct, only something to witness. The chain swayed once more above, slower now, its movement fading as the air settled, and the hollow sound it made against the bucket no longer echoed with weight, it passed through the space like any ordinary sound would, unnoticed unless someone chose to listen for it, and the horse did not react, not because it had forgotten, but because it had understood, and that difference settled deep into the quiet between them. Outside, one of the men finally took a step forward, his boots crunching against the gravel, breaking the edge of the silence that had held the crowd in place, and another followed, then a third, drawn not by curiosity anymore but by something closer to respect, something they had not expected to feel when they first gathered, and though they did not cross into the barn, they stood near the entrance, watching with a new kind of stillness, one that did not rush to judge. Daniel turned his head slightly, aware of them without fully looking, and for the first time since it began, he spoke, not loudly, not to explain, but simply to acknowledge the moment as it was, saying that sometimes a horse does not need to be taught how to move forward, it only needs to be given the chance to stand where it once could not, and his voice carried no pride, no defense, only a quiet certainty that settled into the space as naturally as the fading light. The Mustang lowered its head a little more, its ears relaxed, its posture softened, and then it did something small but undeniable, it reached forward and brushed its muzzle lightly against the edge of the bucket, causing the chain above to sway once again, producing that same metallic note, clear and steady, and this time it did not step back, it did not hesitate, it remained, as if acknowledging that the sound no longer belonged to the past, it belonged to the present, and in that simple act, something unseen closed, something that had been left open for far too long. A woman at the doorway let out a breath she had been holding, her hands lowering from where they had been clasped together, and the man who had spoken earlier shook his head, not in disapproval now, but in quiet disbelief, because what they had witnessed did not match what they thought they knew, and for a moment none of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much to reduce into words. Daniel stepped back another pace, giving the horse the full space of the barn, and the rope slipped entirely from his hand, falling softly to the floor, unnoticed by the Mustang, because it no longer needed to be held, and as the night settled fully around them, the boundary between man and animal, between past and present, felt less like a division and more like something shared, something that had been carried separately for too long and finally set down in the same place, and in that quiet, with the chain still and the barn at rest, it became clear to those who watched that what they had mistaken for harshness was never meant to harm, but to guide something lost back to where it could stand without fear, and sometimes that kind of guidance does not look gentle from the outside, but from within, it is the only way forward. The night settled deeper over the ranch, wrapping the barn in a quiet that no longer felt heavy but whole, as if something long unsettled had finally found its place, and the Mustang remained where it stood, no longer drawn by the sound, no longer bound by it, but present in a way that made the space itself feel different, calmer, steadier, and Daniel Hayes stepped back toward the doorway, not to leave, but to give the horse the final choice, because what mattered now was not what had already been faced, but what would come next. The crowd had thinned without anyone quite noticing, some drifting away in silence, others lingering at a respectful distance, their earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, something that did not demand explanation, and the man who had once spoken with doubt now stood with his hat in his hands, watching the scene with a softened gaze, as if he understood that there were things a person could not judge from the outside, not truly. Inside the barn, the Mustang lifted its head slowly, its ears relaxed, its breathing even, and for a moment it simply looked around, taking in the space not as a place of memory, but as a place it now understood in its own way, and then it turned, not sharply, not with urgency, but with intention, and walked toward the open doorway where the faint glow of starlight outlined the shape of the world beyond. Daniel did not move to meet it, did not reach for the rope that lay forgotten on the ground, because there was nothing left to hold, and as the horse stepped past him, its shoulder brushing lightly against his arm, there was no tension in the contact, no hesitation, only a quiet acknowledgement that passed between them without the need for sound. Outside, the air felt cooler. The wide stretch of land opening into the night, and the Mustang paused just beyond the threshold, lifting its head toward the open sky as if measuring something unseen, something no longer tied to the barn behind it, and Daniel followed a few steps behind, his boots soft against the dirt, his presence steady but no longer guiding. A woman near the fence whispered that the horse was free now, and no one corrected her, because it felt true in a way that did not need clarification, and yet Daniel knew it was more than that. It was not just freedom from the rope, not just freedom from the space, it was freedom from something carried far longer than anyone had seen. The Mustang took a few more steps into the yard, then stopped again, turning its head slightly back toward the barn, not with fear, not with resistance, but with recognition, as if acknowledging a place that had once held something it could not face and now held nothing at all, and after a quiet moment it turned forward once more, walking toward the open land without urgency, without hesitation, its movements calm, grounded, and certain. Daniel remained where he was, watching without calling it back, without following too closely, because this was not about possession, it never had been, and as the distance between them grew by a few yards, it did not feel like separation, it felt like something shared continuing in different directions, something that did not need to be held to remain real. The night carried a soft breeze across the ranch, stirring the grass and brushing against the barn behind them, where the chain now hung completely still, silent in a way it had not been before, and for the first time in years, that silence did not carry weight. It carried peace, and those who remained could feel it. Even if they could not explain why, because sometimes the most powerful changes are not the ones that make noise, but the ones that leave a quiet behind them where something heavy used to be. The distance between them stretched across the open yard, not far in miles but far enough to mark a change that could not be undone, and the Mustang moved with a quiet certainty that did not rush or hesitate, its hooves pressing into the earth with a rhythm that belonged entirely to the present, while Daniel Hayes remained near the barn, his silhouette still against the dim outline of weathered wood, watching not with ownership, not with expectation, but with a calm acceptance that settled deeper than words. The few people who had stayed now stood in silence, their earlier doubts replaced by something quieter, something closer to reflection, as if they were not only watching the horse walk away but also reconsidering what they had believed when the rope was first drawn tight and the blindfold covered those steady eyes, and no one spoke because the moment did not call for explanation. It called for understanding that could only arrive on its own. The Mustang paused once more at the edge of the open land, where the ranch gave way to a wider stretch of field, and it turned its head slightly, not all the way back, just enough to take in the barn, the doorway, and the man who had stood beside it without forcing it forward, and in that brief glance there was no fear, no confusion, only a quiet recognition, as if something unspoken had passed fully between them and no longer needed to be held. Daniel did not step closer, did not call out, he simply nodded once, a small movement that no one else seemed to notice, but it carried the weight of something finished, something set right not by control but by patience, and the Mustang lowered its head slightly before turning forward again, continuing into the open night where the land stretched wide under a sky scattered with distant stars. The wind moved gently across the field, brushing through the grass and carrying with it the faint scent of earth cooling after a long day, and the horse disappeared gradually into that quiet distance. Not vanishing all at once but becoming part of the landscape it had always belonged to, until only the soft sound of its steps remained, and then even that faded, leaving behind a stillness that felt complete rather than empty. Behind them, the barn stood unchanged in form but altered in meaning, its shadows no longer holding the same weight, its silence no longer echoing with something unresolved, and inside, the chain hung motionless, the bucket resting without sound, as if the space itself had released what it had been carrying. One by one, the remaining onlookers turned away, not with the hurried steps of dismissal but with a slower, more thoughtful pace, each person carrying something different from what they had witnessed, something that would not be spoken easily but would remain, shaping how they saw the next quiet moment they encountered. Daniel stayed where he was for a while longer, his gaze resting on the place where the horse had last stood, and in that stillness there was no need to follow, no need to hold on, because what mattered had already happened, something that could not be taken away by distance or time. He finally turned back toward the barn, his steps unhurried, his presence steady, and as he crossed the threshold once more, the night settled fully around the ranch, wrapping it in a calm that felt earned rather than given. Sometimes the hardest thing a man can do is not to lead, not to hold, but to stand beside something long enough for it to find its own way forward, and sometimes the strongest bond is not the one that keeps something close, but the one that allows it to walk away without fear, carrying with it not the weight of the past, but the quiet strength of having faced it and moved beyond it.